The recorder arrived on a Tuesday. That was what Mara Solis called it afterward. In the deposition she was never supposed to give. In the room where the fluorescent light buzzed like a dying nerve. The recorder. Not the alien. Not the creature. Not even the visitor. Which was what the Brain Center's pamphlets would later insist upon. She called it the recorder because that is what it did. It watched. It listened. Cataloged. And for 22 days, it moved through the ruins of what they'd built, and it put all of it inside itself, neat and precise. The way you press a flower in a book and forget about it, until one day the pages fall open, and you find the thing you pressed, still there, still shaped like what it was but dry as dust and utterly without smell. She was 41 years old. She had bad knees and a habit of biting the inside of her cheek when she was thinking hard. She had worked in the compliance documentation wing of the Brain Center for 11 years, and she had not, in all of that time, done a single thing she was proud of. But that came later. The morning the recorder arrived, Mara was at her workstation in Sublevel 4, transcribing intake classifications for a group of citizens who had applied for reclassification from Integrated Provisional to Integrated Standard. The forms were 17 pages long. The forms were always 17 pages long. She had transcribed octave from so many times, that her fingers sometimes moved through the motions while she was thinking about something else, entirely which she recognized dully as a kind of loss she did not have a name for. The overhead announcement came through the ceiling speakers at Eero 847, calm and toneless in the way. All Brain Center communications were calm and toneless, as if the voice itself had been classified and integrated and found acceptable. Attention compliance documentation personnel. An anomalous entity has been detected moving through Sector 9, above ground. The entity is non-hostile. The entity is recording. Observation teams have been dispatched. Personnel are advised to continue standard operations. Mara looked up from her screen. Around her, no one else looked up. The woman at the next workstation, a tall, thin person named Fen who had once years ago shown Mara a photograph of a lake she'd visited before the lake was drained. Fen did not look up. The three men at the far terminals did not look up. Supervisor's glass door remained closed. The air filtration system continued its low, purposeful hum. Mara saved her work. She stood. She put on her outer coat, because the corridor to the observation level was cold, and she walked to the elevator. She told herself she was going for the view. She had told herself many things over the years that were not quite lies and not quite true. The recorder was standing in the plaza, above Sublevel 4 when Mara reached the observation corridor, and her first thought, looking down through the reinforced glass, was that it looked like something that had been made by a person who had never seen a person but had read very detailed description of one. It was tall, not extravagantly tall, tall enough that the three compliance observers, standing at a cautious distance from it, had to look up, and there was something in the angle of their gaze, in the particular tilt of their chins, that made Mara think of children. Creature's body was encased in a carapace that looked less like armor and more like the body itself, black and smooth and jointed, the ribs visible not as bones but as structural elements, as if something had designed a human skeleton, and then realized it needed to also be sure. Its head was long, longer than it should have been, tapering at the back into a shape that was almost architectural. Her eyes should have been there, was instead a single wide lens, glass, or something like glass, dark and deep. In the center of the chest, two spools of tape rotated slowly. The tape was turning. It had been turning since the moment it arrived, or so the observer's report would later note, and it would keep turning for 22 days, and when they finally brought the recorder down, tape would still be turning, even then, even after. Mara stood at the glass and watched it watch. It was looking at everything. That was the thing she noticed. The thing that did not match the pamphlet's word visitor. A visitor looks at things. This was different. The recorder looked at things the way you look at a map, not to appreciate the cartography, but to understand where you are. One of the observers below raised a hand in a gesture that Brain Center manuals classified as non-threatening welcome posture. The recorder turned its lens toward him. It did not respond. The tape spools turned. Mara watched for a long time. When she went back to her workstation, she did not resume the intake classifications. She sat with her hands in her lap and thought about the two tape spools, and what it meant that something had crossed however many light years of empty space and arrived here, carrying recording equipment. What were you recording for, she thought. Who were you going to show? The Brain Center issued its formal assessment 3 days later. The recorder was an extraterrestrial intelligence, origin unknown, mission assessment, observational. It was moving through Sector 9 in a pattern that the analytical division described as systematic. It was not interfering with operations. It appeared to be documenting. The recommendation was to continue normal operations and allow the documentation to proceed. Normal operations. Mara thought about that phrase while she transcribed 17-page intake forms. She thought about it while she ate her lunch in the gray refectory, at the gray table, with the gray tray. She thought about it during the mandatory afternoon civic orientation session, where a recorded voice explained the function of integration levels and the necessity of compliance documentation for the health of the whole. And she looked around the room at the faces of the other attendees, each face arranged in its appropriate expression. And she thought, this is what it's recording. This. They were all going to be in there. In those tape spools. A whole civilization, reduced to what it looked like from the outside, through a lens, by something that had no context for any of it. No memory of what it had been. Before the Brain Center, no sense of what had been paved over and drained and reclassified into compliance. She went home that evening by the route she always took, past the brutalist blocks of the residential integration towers, past the assessment kiosks, past the checkpoint where she showed her citizen card out of habit, the guard scanning it without looking at her face. The way she fed forms into the documentation system without reading them. And she thought, if you were recording this, what would you think we were? She thought, we would look like something that happened to us. She thought about the reproduction print on the wall of the filing archive, the old piece behind cracked glass that she had walked past hundreds of times. It was from some Swiss surrealist, a century before, a figure that was also architecture, or architecture that was also a figure. Between flesh and mechanism dissolved past the point of asking which came first. She had stood in front of it once during a filing interval, 3 years ago, and looked at it until she became aware of time passing, which was not something she usually noticed. She had thought then, someone made this before they knew they needed to make it. Like they were already dreaming something that hadn't been invented yet. Now she thought about the tape reels in the recorder's chest, the way they turned, and she thought that the drawing and the recorder were not as far apart as the distance between them should have made them. That something had been imagined once, that pointed in the direction of something real. And she thought, what else did we dream? That was actually a memory of something we hadn't met yet. She went to bed and lay there with those thoughts. And eventually she got up and began to write. On the 5th day, she went looking for the other documentation workers who had seen it. This was not a sanctioned activity. Talking about the recorder was technically within normal operations. The Brain Center had not issued a speech restriction. Issuing a speech restriction would have implied the subject was worth restricting, which would have implied more than the Brain Center wanted to imply. But there was a texture to the not discussing of it, in the corridors and the refectory, that she recognized. She had felt that texture for 11 years. It was the texture of a room of people all deciding individually not to be the one to say the thing out loud. She started with Fen. Fen was at her workstation during the lunch interval, eating from the standardized nutrition container in the efficient manner Fen had perfected over the years. No pause, no enjoyment registered, just the conversion of fuel into continued functionality. Mara sat down across from her and said nothing, and Fen looked up. You went to the observation corridor, Fen said. On the first day. Yes. Fen looked back at her container. I watched it from the corridor on sub-level 3 instead, so I could see the plaza and the corridor at once. Pause. You were there for 40 minutes. Mara thought about that. You timed it. I noticed. They ate in silence for a moment. The refectory hummed with the climate control and the low murmur of approved conversation. Weather, productivity metrics, the status of current reclassification cycles. The tape, Fen said, very quietly. Did you notice the tape doesn't turn at a constant speed? Mara looked at her. When it's scanning infrastructure, the corridors, the processing halls, the checkpoints, the tape turns at a steady rate. But when something unexpected happens, when someone drops something, or a child makes a noise from the family integration block, Fen paused. When something happens that doesn't fit the pattern, the tape turns faster. Mara thought about Tilda on the bench, humming 3 notes. It's paying more attention, she said. The documentation rate increases. Yes. Fen folded the top of the nutrition container with precise movements. Whatever is on the other end of that tape, it flags anomalies. The expected is just data. The unexpected is information. They looked at each other across the gray table. Then we're mostly data, Mara said. So far, Fen said. She found the recorder in the park on the 7th day, or rather the park that had been a park, before it was reclassified as Citizen Recreation and Approved Movement Facility, the name having been changed because park implied something unstructured, something that simply existed for the sake of existing, was not a category the classification system recognized. The recorder was standing beside the line of identical trees, the ones planted at regulation intervals, and it had its lens directed at the single bench where a woman was sitting. The woman was old. She had the look of someone who had been integrated for so long that the integration had become indistinguishable from the person, which was, Mara knew, the intended outcome. The old woman was sitting on the bench with her hands in her lap, looking at nothing, or at something no one else could see. Mara stood at the edge of the facility and watched the recorder watch the old woman. The tape spools turned. The old woman sat. After a while she began to hum, low and tuneless, the sound barely audible across the distance, but Mara caught it. 3 notes. Repeated. The kind of sound you make without deciding to. The kind that means nothing and everything. The kind that is just the body insisting on its own aliveness in the smallest possible way. The recorder's lens tracked to the sound. Tape turned faster. Mara walked over. She had not planned to. She had no reason to. She was an 11-year documentation compliance worker, with bad knees and a habit of keeping her head down, and there was a compliance observer standing at the far end of the facility, watching all of this. And she walked over anyway. She stood beside the recorder. She was close enough to hear the mechanism of the tape, the faint whir of the spools, and up close the black carapace had a texture she hadn't expected. Not smooth exactly, but dense, as if it had been grown rather than built, as if the boundary between the thing inside and the thing outside was a suggestion rather than a fact. She said, to the side of the lens, she used to have a garden. The recorder turned toward her. The woman on the bench, her name is Tilda. She grew things. I don't know what, food, probably flowers maybe, before the resource reallocation. She's been sitting on that bench every morning for 6 years and no one has ever asked her what she's thinking about. The lens was very close. She could see herself in it, distorted and small. I don't know if you understand me, she said. Shh. I don't know what you're recording this for. But I thought, if you're making a record, if something is going to see this, then that should be in it too. Not just the buildings and the checkpoints and the forms. The bench. The humming. What's underneath? She turned and walked back to the corridor entrance. And she did not look at the compliance observer. And she did not look back. Behind her, tape turned. She was called to the supervisor's office the following morning. The supervisor's name was Court. He was a compact man with a face that had been optimized over many years of institutional service to express a range of emotions that were all variations of mild professional concern. He had a citizen classification of Integrated Standard Senior and a desk with nothing on it except a single terminal and a glass of water that Mara had never seen him drink from. You were observed, he said, interacting with the anomalous entity in the Citizen Recreation and Approved Movement facility yesterday. I spoke to it, Mara said. Briefly, that is outside your operational parameters. I know. Court looked at her. His expression was at the mild concern setting. The entity is here to observe. It is not here to interact. Function is to continue normal operations. Normal operations, Mara said. That's correct. She looked at the glass of water on his desk. She thought about Tilda on the bench, humming 3 notes, hands in her lap. What does it think we are? She said. The entity. Do you know? Has anyone in the brain center asked what it thinks we are? From out there? From wherever it came from? Court's expression remained at mild concern. That, he said, is not a question that falls within the scope of compliance documentation. Mara thought about that. She thought about the 17-page intake forms and the gray tray in the gray refectory, and 11 years of not doing a single thing she was proud. I'll return to my workstation, she said. She stood and she did not apologize, which was unusual. He noted it. She could tell by the small recalibration of his mild, concerned face. She went back downstairs, and she sat at her terminal, and she did not open the intake forms. She opened a blank documentation form instead, and she began to type. The recorder moved through a different sector every 2 days, and Mara began to follow it. Not closely, not obviously. She told herself she was just adjusting her routes, taking different pathways, eating at different refectory stations. But her routes adjusted themselves always toward wherever the compliance observer reports placed the recorder that morning. She watched it in the integration tower lobbies. Citizens filed through the ID scanners in the morning silence that was not peaceful silence, but the silence of people who had learned not to speak without purpose. She watched it in the documentation processing halls, where banks of terminals hummed and workers sat in regulated rows, and everything that had ever happened to a citizen was compressed into a file and filed. She watched it in the medical compliance facilities, where the intake line wound around the corner, and the citizens in the line did not look at each other but looked instead at the floor, each face arranged in the same arrangement of patient cooperative non-expression. The tape turned. The lens moved. She kept typing on the blank forms. She did not file them. She did not format them the way intake forms were formatted. She wrote things down because the recorder was recording. And because whatever the recorder sent back to wherever it came from, she wanted there to be something else in it. She wrote about Fen and the photograph of the lake. She wrote about a man she'd seen in the checkpoint queue once, who had been holding a child's drawing, a house, a sun, stick figures with enormous hands, folded into his inside pocket, taking it out for just a moment to look at it before putting it back and stepping forward in the queue. She wrote about the baker in sublevel 7s who was technically operating outside approved recreational activity guidelines, because he sometimes, on the nights when the compliance monitors had lower activity, baked bread that smelled like bread, had smelled before the standardized nutrition formulation, and everyone in the corridor knew about it, and no one reported it, and if you knocked at the right time, you could eat a piece of it warm. She wrote about the 3 notes Tilda hummed on the bench, and that Tilda's daughter had moved to Sector 3, and wrote letters that arrived 6 weeks late, and were opened and resealed by the documentation office before delivery. She wrote, "Think you are looking at the walls, and the checkpoints, and the silence, and you are recording all of it, and you will take it back, and whatever uses it will look at it and say, this is what they are. But that is not what we are. What we are is what we do when no one is supposed to be watching. What we are is the bread. What we are is the child's drawing in the inside pocket. What we are is the 3 notes that mean nothing and survive everything." She saved the document. She did not file it. She thought about where the recorder went when its observations were done, and who would see the record, and whether there was anyone on the other end of those tape spools who was capable of hearing the 3 notes inside all the silence. On the 14th day, the brain center escalated its assessment. The recorder had reached Sector 2, which was the administrative core, and the analytical division had flagged a pattern in its movement that they described. In the language of analytical divisions, purposeful approach to sensitive infrastructure. 3 additional compliance observer teams were deployed. The citizen advisory was updated to note that interactions with the entity remained inadvisable. Mara was in the corridor outside sublevel 2 when she heard the change in the crowd. Not a sound exactly, but an absence of sound. The particular silence that happens when something unexpected occurs, and everyone simultaneously decides not to be the first to react to it. Porter was in the main pre-processing hall. It had walked far through the outer checkpoint. The compliance observers, she learned later, had not been in position yet, the escalation having been issued faster than the deployment could follow. and it was standing in the center of the processing hall, surrounded by the rows of documentation workers at their terminals, and every person in the hall had stopped typing. Every person was looking at it, and it was turning, slowly, its lens moving across the room, across the rows of stopped faces, across the walls, hung with the classification charts and the productivity targets, and the framed statement of the brain center's foundational integration, efficiency, continuity. The tape was turning. Mara walked in. She walked through the door that she had no reason to walk through, that she had no authorization to walk through, in the way that she had walked across the park toward the old woman on the bench, with the same sensation that she later described as not courage exactly, but something simpler. The feeling of a decision that had already been made, that she was only now catching up to. She walked to the center of the hall to where the recorder was standing, and she stopped in front of it. The lens looked at her. The whole room looked at her. She reached into her coat pocket, and she took out the folded papers. The forms she had been filling out for 14 days, 80-odd pages of things she had written not for the filing system but for the tape. And she held them up to the lens. "I don't know if you can read this," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "I don't know how your records work. I don't know how long it'll be to reach wherever you're sending it, or whether anyone there will understand what they're looking at, but I want you to have it. Whatever you take back from here, I want this to be in it." The lens was very close. "We built this," she said. "Checkpoints and the forms and the classification levels. We built it and we let it be built on us, and most days, none of us say anything because saying something is a 17-page form and an office summons and a reclassification review, and eventually easier not to." She paused. "The bread is real. The photograph of the lake is real. The drawing in the pocket, the bench, all of it is real. And if something is going to look at this record and decide what we are, then they should know that the walls are not us. The walls are what happened to us. What we are is still happening underneath." The hall was completely silent. Every face turned toward her. Tape turned. Very slowly the recorder reached out one black carapaced arm, and its fingers, if they were fingers, closed around the folded papers. Gently, the way you take something offered. Mara let go. Compliance observers arrived 4 minutes later. The formal review process was initiated. There were forms. 17 pages, and then more after that. Mara sat in the rooms they brought her to, and she answered the questions they asked. And she did not apologize, and she did not explain the document to them, because she had not written it for them, and that distinction seemed to her the most important one she had ever made. The recorder was escorted out of the processing hall. The observation teams tracked it to the edge of Sector 1. On the morning of the 16th day, it was gone from the city entirely, moving north, by the tracking reports, toward the open territories where the resource reallocation had left nothing but the stripped clean infrastructure of the former lake basins and the old agricultural zones, long since reclassified as unproductive. It moved through those territories for 6 days, alone, the tape turning, and then, on the 22nd day, it stopped. The observation teams found it standing in the center of one of the old lake basins, which was dry now. The lake bed, cracked and pale in the midday light, the concentric rings of what had been shoreline visible in the earth like the marks of a finger, into wax. The recorder was standing at the center of the basin in the posture. And they noted this in the report, because they were thorough, because documentation was what they did. The posture of something looking at what used to be. The tape spools were full. When the teams approached, recorder did not move, and they realized, by the time they reached it, that the mechanism had ceased. The body was still. The lens was open but unseeing, the way eyes are when what was behind them is somewhere else. They turned the limbs, the report noted, and found nothing inside. Wherever it had gone all the way. Mara was still in review when the formal assessment of the recorder's death was issued. She read the report on the terminal in the review room during the unsupervised interval between sessions, and she read it the way she had learned to read documents in 11 years of compliance work. For the gaps, what the language was arranged around rather than what it said. The report noted the full tape spools. It noted that the tape had been recovered. It noted that the contents were currently under analytical evaluation, and that no further information regarding dissemination of the recorded material was available at this time. She understood what that meant. She thought about the folded pages, tucked inside that black carapace, against whatever was inside that black carapace. She thought about them going wherever the recorder had gone. The reel it, the animating it, part that had looked at Tilda on the bench, and turned the tape faster for a woman humming 3 notes. She thought, you have it. Whatever comes next, you have it, she thought. We gave you the walls, and we gave you the checkpoints, and we gave you the silence. We also gave you the bread, and the photograph, and the child's drawing, and the bench. We gave you what we did when we thought only you were watching. We gave you what we couldn't give to each other in the rooms where the lights hummed, and the forms were 17 pages and being seen was a risk no one could afford. We gave you us, the real us, the us underneath. There was, in the end, a trial of sorts. The word trial was not used. The classification system did not have a category for it. There was instead a compliance adjudication review, which was a different thing. In the same way that a citizen recreation and approved movement facility was a different thing. At the compliance adjudication review, Mara sat in the correct chair in the correct room and was asked whether she understood that unauthorized interaction with an anomalous entity constituted a violation of Brain Center Protocol Section 14, subsection C, 9. She said she did. She was asked whether she understood that the unauthorized transfer of documentation materials to an external entity was a violation of Brain Center Protocol Section 8, subsection A, paragraphs 1 through 7. She said she did. She was asked whether she had anything to say before the adjudication panel issued its determination. She thought about it for a long moment. The recorder came here to find out what we are, she said. I was worried it was only going to find out what we've been doing. I wanted it to find out both. The panel looked at her. We built the walls, she said. But we didn't stop being the thing that builds gardens. We didn't stop humming 3 notes on a bench. We didn't stop keeping drawings in our pockets. The Brain Center can classify that or not classify it. The tape already has it. The panel deliberated for 47 minutes. She was reclassified, but here is the thing about tape. Goes somewhere. The recorder had been sent by someone. The tape had been sent for something. Whatever entity or intelligence or civilization had dispatched a biomechanical observer across the distances between stars to document what was happening on this particular piece of rock had done so with an intention. And intentions have conclusions. Mara did not know this on the day of her reclassification, or in the months that followed, or in the years that accumulated around her, like the particular sediment of a life that had been, at some point, cracked open and rearranged, so that what grew in the crack was something she had not expected. She knew it later. In the way you know things is later, when the event that always was going to happen finally catches up to the time you're living in. A contact was received, not through the Brain Center's communication infrastructure, which was designed to receive only what the Brain Center expected to receive, through the frequencies that no one had bothered to monitor, because they were frequencies where nothing was supposed to arrive. Low, patient, signal repeating for weeks, before anyone happened to be tuned to the right register to hear it. The Analytical Division's report described it as a transmission of unknown origin containing structured data of unknown format, which was how the Analytical Division described most things that did not have a category. But there were people, in the divisions below the Analytical Division, who were good at things the Brain Center did not officially have categories for. One of them, a young engineer named Pell, who had a habit of working on unofficial problems during the hours the monitors were cycling, spent 11 days on the transmin and came to Mara's reassignment office. She had been reassigned, after the adjudication, to a subterranean documentation archive that no one ever visited, and put his results on her desk. The transmission contained 2 kinds of data. The first was an exact duplicate of everything on the recorder's tape. Everything it had seen and heard in its 22 days of observation. Everything Mara had described. The checkpoints and the silence and the processing halls, yes, and the bench, and the 3 notes, and the bread. The second was a response. Pell could not fully decode the response. Parts of it remained opaque, the format genuinely alien in ways that would take years and better tools to fully unpack. But there was a section that repeated, that recurred in every iteration of the transmission, and Pell had worked out enough of it to understand the shape, if not every specific word. It was addressed as best they could tell to the humans. It said something that translated imperfectly, clumsily, as, "Seen what is above you. We have also seen what is underneath. We have been recording long enough to know the difference. Shh. We have been watching long enough to know which one matters." And then it said something that might have been a question, or might have been an invitation, or might have been a statement. The syntax did not map cleanly, that translated, in Pell's best effort, as, "The walls are not permanent." "Are you?" Mara read the translation 3 times. Sat with it, in the subterranean archive, where all the old records were kept, the actual paper ones from before everything went digital. And she thought about the recorder standing in the dry lake bed, with the full tape and the still machinery, and she thought about whatever it was that had crossed the empty distances to arrive here, carrying nothing but the equipment to listen. They had listened. They had taken the tape. They had heard the 3 notes inside the silence. And now they were asking, the thing underneath, the thing that hums and bakes bread and keeps drawings in coat pockets, is it still there? Can it still move? She looked at the old records around her. The pre-brain center records, the ones that used words like Citizens Council and Public Forum and disagreement, words the current classification system had no positive entries for. There was one box she had looked in only once, in her first week in the archive, before the dust made her eyes water, and the fluorescent light began its particular headache, and she had retreated, back to the minimal light of her reassignment terminal. She pulled it out now and set it on the table and opened it. Forms. But older forms, a different kind. Petitions, they were called on the header, a word that meant something like official asking, which was a concept the brain center had reclassified out of the system decades ago, on the grounds that it implied the possibility of the system saying no, which implied the possibility of the system being wrong, which was outside the scope of integrated operations. Petitions were about things like parks and bakeries and lake preservation, and the right to keep a record of your own life in your own words, rather than in the brain center's classification language. She held one of them. The paper was dry and slightly brittle, the typing faded but legible. At the bottom, dozens of names, real names with the loops and pictures of individual hands, nothing standardized about them, each signature its own argument for the existence of the person who made it. She thought about the recorder putting its lens on those pages, if it could have. She thought, the tape would have turned fast for this, she thought. We have been trying to talk to each other this whole time. We've been pass notes in coat pockets and humming 3 notes on benches and baking bread out the approved parameters and signing our names on petitions that were never answered. And we have been doing it so quietly, so carefully, in the margins of the system that classified us. Even we couldn't see how much of it there was, until something came from far enough away and listened to all of it at once. She thought about what it had felt like when the recorder took the folded pages from her hand. The gentleness of it, the recognition. Not the recognition of one being encountering another, though it was that too, but the recognition of something being received, of the right signal reaching the receiver it was always meant for. She thought about what Pell had said when he handed her the translation, that the signal was still transmitting, that it had been transmitting for weeks, that whatever sent it had not sent it and gone silent and waited for a response in the normal institutional way, which was to say, sent a message and then arranged everything around the assumption that the message had been received, and no acknowledgement was necessary because acknowledgement implied uncertainty about the outcome. The signal was still transmitting because whoever sent it was not certain. They were waiting to find out. Mara set the petition back in the box and closed it, and thought about Fen and the photograph of the lake, the real lake before it was drained, the blue of it, the way Fen had described how you could smell it from a half-mile out in summer, particular smell of living water. She thought about Tilda, still on the bench every morning, still humming 3 notes. She thought about the baker in sublevel 7, And the man with the child's drawing and the compliance observer who had watched her walk across the park toward the recorder and had written in his report. She had seen this in the adjudication. The phrase, subject behavior appeared purposeful, nature of purpose unclear. She thought, I know the nature. She looked at the old records around her, pre-brain center records, the ones that used words like citizens' council and public forum and disagreement. The current classification system had no positive entries for. She thought, yes. She thought, we are still here. We were always here. You just needed to be from far enough away to see us. She picked up a pen, an actual pen, from the supply drawer no one had touched in 11 years. And she wrote at the bottom of Pell's translation, in the margin, tell them yes. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket, beside nothing, because she had nothing in her pockets. Because she had spent 11 years moving through the brain center with empty pockets and a habit of keeping her head down. And she thought, that changes now. She stood up. Outside the archive, above the sublevels, above the processing halls and the checkpoints and the citizen recreation and approved movement facilities. The signal was still transmitting, patient and low, cycling through its frequencies, waiting for the answer. It had come from far enough away to wait. Somewhere above her, Fen was at her workstation. Somewhere in the facility, Tilda's daughter's letter was being opened and resealed before delivery. Somewhere in sublevel 7, the smell of bread was leaking under a door. The recorder had come here to find out what humanity was. It had turned its lens on the walls and the checkpoints and the compliance halls, and it had recorded all of it. And it had also recorded the 3 notes and the bread and the drawings and the petition signatures and the photograph of the lake, and it had taken all of it home, and the answer had come back, patient and low and still transmitting. The walls are not permanent, are you? We are still here, Mara thought. And we are still asking. And we have been asking for a very long time, in every margin we could find. In every small act that the classification system had no positive category for. In every quiet piece of evidence that the thing underneath us was alive and had not stopped moving. You asked if we were permanent. We are something better than permanent. We are stubborn. Mara climbed the stairs.